Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, hello.
Awesome.
How's it, how's it going?
Not too bad. How are you?
Can't complain. Well, actually, I can because I can't figure out how to make something. Something's really like mucked up with this right now. It thinks I'm live on two separate events, and
Okay.
neither of which can I actually go live. So they're both just live, showing this dead signal.
Hmm.
I have no idea what's going on.
Well, our connection's pretty good, so
Yeah, it's not on my end. It's got to be some sort of weird server error going uh, on Google's part,
okay. Well, hopefully we can get
which
that sorted.
I really wish that this was not what was going on. Because I've done like a million of these streams. Oh wait, we are live.
Oh, are we? Okay.
All right. So that whole discussion we've been having, they've just been listening to it.
Nice.
All right. All right. All right. Well, that's a good way to get started. Hello, everybody on the internet. Very surprisingly, very fast. Hey, everybody, welcome to the what's this thing called? Stepback's subscriber appreciation day that I do once a month when I can find someone to come and join me for it, where I basically hang out with y'all and I get you guys to talk to awesome and cool creative folks that I happen to have on my Rolodex. And one who we've got today is someone that I've been very excited to do a stream with. This is someone I have maybe not explicitly collaborated with, but have definitely talked behind the scenes and worked with on a couple of projects over the years. Someone whose channel I've been a very big fan of for a long time and who has had some massive big successes in 2018 and hopefully beyond. So I want to welcome Andrew Mark Henry from the channel Religion for Breakfast.
Great to be here. And yeah, we've never publicly collaborated, but I would say we collaborated because we've shared scripts and worked on videos together, usually on the script writing phase of things.
Yeah, for anybody who's a fan of like the religion videos I've done, most of the time I will work with you. I will help. You'll help me out on that. Most notably, I think you gave the most amount of input on my one on the holy foreskin of Jesus.
Oh yes, of course. That who could forget that one?
That was a good one. So please, before we ramble on and start getting into the questions, could you please introduce yourself and what Religion for Breakfast is all about?
Of course, yeah. So I'm a PhD student in religious studies at Boston University. So religious studies is the academic, non-sectarian study of religion. So I study religion as a anthropologist and as a sociologist. And Religion for Breakfast is basically that, an educational channel where we study religion as a dimension of human culture. So I've been trained as a historian and archaeologist mostly. So I do a lot of history and archaeology of Greco-Roman religion, but the channel's kind of grown into a more comparative religions channel. So I'll sometimes do Buddhism or Islam or sometimes even cover like secularism in the 21st century. So religious studies writ large.
Yeah, I've almost been tempted to walk back from like the most popular series I have on my channel, which is talking about religion. So, because I have that whole series where I do summaries of popular religion. And also, I want to say thank you, Kali, as a sign of my appreciation as a subscriber for you and your consistently fantastic content. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Kali, for the super chat. That's really kind of you. No question, though, from that. But yeah, secular. So yeah, first of all, I probably should have known that there was like secular study of religion. It was something that I was thinking of getting into at one point. I just didn't realize that it was its own field.
Yeah, it's kind of frustrating because it's a field that has a public relations problem. Because when I say I study religious studies, people wonder, "Oh, are you a pastor? Are you studying to be a missionary?" And I'm like, "No, I'm not. I'm sorry," because people confuse it with theology or pastoral training, stuff like that. But it's really an interdisciplinary field. So we have historians, we have anthropologists, even neuroscientists. Some of the coolest religious studies research is done by like cognitive researchers who study oxytocin levels in the bloodstream as they do rituals. So it's a dimension of human culture. So it's open to academic inquiry.
Yeah, I remember that like back in the day when I was thinking of going into something that was closer akin to what you do, um, the only school in an English speaking country that was doing what I wanted to do would have involved me having to get into Harvard Divinity, which I
Yeah.
imagine as a Boston U person, you're like, screw those guys.
No, actually, I mean, like, so they have a branding problem. Divinity school has a certain ring to it. Oh, you're going there to be a pastor. But like, I have a lot of friends that go to Harvard Divinity School and they're religious studies scholars. I have a lot that go there that are also studying to be pastors in the Christian tradition. So that school is interdisciplinary in a sense of theologians and religious studies scholars. Boston University's religion department is like strictly secular study of religion. The School of Theology at Boston University, they do the more Jesus-y stuff.
Mm-hmm. So, but I imagine that for because especially like in like the Catholic tradition, like their clergy are also usually pretty scholarly.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know enough about Roman Catholicism or Catholicism to know that, but I know I think you have to get like your master's in like a master's of divinity of some sort before you can become a priest. So there is like some pretty, you know, intense educational criteria.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be the master. You have to make the math of 1 = 3 make sense to you.
Yeah, this is true. This is true. It's the paradox of theology. But yeah, you should never back away from your religion content. I've always enjoyed it, and there's not enough of it on YouTube. When people talk about religion on YouTube, it's usually trying to convert somebody or saying how much they hate religion. But your content, you know, you have the Baha'i video, you have the Holy Foreskin of Jesus video. Like you do religious studies on Step Back.
Yeah, I think the one I was the most proud of was the one where I was like, I'm going to make the summary of the Church of Latter-day Saints without being a dick, which is not exactly common on the internet.
Yeah, well, people think they're being edgy when they make fun of a religion like that. And I'm like, you know, what's really edgy is to try to explore it from a relatively neutral academic perspective. That actually puts you into a different league. So yeah, I appreciate that.
But also, like, I don't know if maybe this will get some, if there's any Christians watching, kind of ticked, but like for like living up to Christian principles of like, you know, charity and family and brotherhood and stuff like that, Mormons got you cornered in a lot of cases. They live their truth, you know.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, I live in the United States. I know you're Canadian, but in the U.S. we have this, you know, debate of religion and politics happening all the time, and the support of our current president. And it's interesting to see, at least in the 2016 election, how Utah voted differently because of the large Mormon population. There's like a different brand of politics there. Still conservative, but not necessarily mainstream.
As someone who's married to an American and also someone who does a lot of U.S. history, like that was my grad school area before, like after the religion change. But the idea of religion politics is actually pretty interesting. It's really huge because like in my country of Canada, it's actually considered kind of like, even culturally, like it's sort of considered impolite to ask anybody what religion they belong to, and it's considered sort of rude to preach your religion in public. And so, and in politics even more so, like until like recently, because you know all of the like shit that has like sort of been spraying across politics across the world is starting to encroach on us this year, but being socially conservative was kind of considered an uncouth thing to say. Even conservatives would be like, oh no, we would never be socially conservative.
Yeah. And what's interesting, in 2018, there was a whole bunch of state legislatures that introduced Bible literacy bills, trying to get Bible classes into the classroom. And on the surface, if they're like constitutionally sound classes, I'm okay with that. Like it's a work of human culture that needs to be studied. It's an important document for you know, American history. But a lot of these bills being introduced, I was skeptical. I'm like, I don't know if you're introducing this for, you know, the secular study of the Bible. I think you're introducing a Sunday school class. So yeah, at least in my own field, politics comes up the most in education, because a lot of public high school teachers are afraid to teach about religion because it does kind of skirt close to First Amendment issues, free speech issues.
Yeah. Now, another question I have for you, since it's January right now, I imagine you're missing it a lot. You did do a stint in the Holy Land.
Mhm.
where you've got the look for it. I imagine that more than one person probably was like, "It's him. He's come back, finally."
Yeah, for those that don't know in the stream, I left to study for my dissertation, my PhD thesis in Jerusalem in December or in January 2017 or 2018 without a beard. And I came back from the Holy Land with a beard. So I joked that I got a Jerusalem syndrome while I was over there, going all messianic with the beard. But yeah, I was in Jerusalem. I traveled all over Israel and Palestine, Israel and the Palestinian territories. All sorts of ancient sites. My goal was to travel to enough sites that I could open up the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament and be like, I've been there, I've been there, I've been there. So I went to Ashkelon to see the Philistine ruins. I went to Samaria, went to Masada, got a whole bunch of footage, made a whole bunch of videos. So it was pretty cool, gotta say.
Probably had some boss falafel.
I had amazing falafel. I can't have falafel back here in the States now. It's just like, it's been ruined for me because I know what the real stuff tastes like.
Mm-hmm. So another thing that, so the one thing, I would love if you could explain this to me and like the politics of this, because I find it fascinating. It's a thing about Jerusalem specifically. It's one little thing. And just how big it is and weird. Okay, I gotta stop preambling. So there is, as far as my recollection goes, and you can jump in as soon as I say something that's wrong because it's almost guaranteed to be true. There is a graveyard in Jerusalem that basically is like the holiest of holies for Jews. Like, if somebody is a particularly pious Jew, they actually will try to get themselves buried in this graveyard in Jerusalem. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I do. I think I know what you're talking about. So the Mount of Olives, which is overlooking the old city of Jerusalem, is the entire slope of it is basically a graveyard. And it's a very interesting graveyard because it's all like stone tombs, basically. And it's this complete concrete and stone just going down the face of it. And I do think that, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but I think the idea is being as close as possible to what's considered the Temple Mount. So at the end of times, they'll be as close as possible to the Temple Mount as possible.
Yeah, so that's that's the next part I wanted to go to. So there's like in the Jewish prophecy for the end of the world, or the whatever it is, there's supposed to be a gate that they're going to walk through. And what I've been told is that there's like sometime a bajillion years ago, some like Islamic ruler of Jerusalem like closed those gates and sealed them off just as like some sort of dick move. And this is like a thing that is ongoing to today, a fight.
I'm Googling it real quick so I don't get it wrong, but there's definitely a gate in that wall. So if you're standing on the Mounts of Olives looking down toward the old city, I think it's called the Golden Gate. So people can Google this if they want. And it's been blocked up. I think it was some early medieval Islamic leader that blocked it up. And it's there. It's clear as day. It's one of the older gates in the old city.
Because like the whole thing, like there's like some stuff that like that it's just like just how many huge religions owe so much to this this city. Because like I'm thinking of like how there's certain things that if you did it, it would cause like untold amounts of havoc. Like if somebody started to open that gate, or for example, if say Jerusalem decided to do a big restoration project on like the Temple of Solomon, and then like because like there's like literal dooms, like literal Christian apocalypse fantasy prophecies about like the end of the world needs this building to be restored in order for like literally like dragons with like 10 heads and 9 crowns and horsemen of the apocalypse stuff to happen. And so like you can't touch some of these things because it'll cause like the literal, like there's a time when I think it was there was like as part of like a historical restoration, Saddam Hussein was restoring, I think, like the Temple of Nineveh or like Solomon Temple or something like that. And people were freaking out because they were like, oh, like this is a thing that's the Antichrist is prophesied to have done.
It's true, and it was a little stressful. You know, I study ancient people, so I'm usually used to dealing with people that have been dead for 1,500 years. So being in a space where even the archaeology is political, it was pretty stressful. And you're totally right. There's actually a huge restoration project of sorts back in the late 90s on the plaza where the Dome of the Rock is, where the the Jordanian government was digging out huge amounts of dirt to help renovate the Al-Aqsa Mosque up there. And then the Israeli government just was flipping out. It's like, you're doing what's essentially an illegal excavation on the Temple Mount. So there's this huge argument. The dirt was dumped into the Kidron Valley, like next to the old city. And so then this, semi-official archaeological project called the Temple Mount Sifting Project was put together at the last minute to sift through all this dirt. So that's, like, again, highly political. Even among archaeologists, people are like, this is not the most well-conducted archaeological excavation. We shouldn't be doing this. But it's like, no matter what I can say, I will upset people. I did my Dome of the Rock video. It's kind of the history of the Dome of the Rock, and people in the comments said, "Oh, you said this that's against my politics, and you said this that's against my religion." And I'm like, I'm sorry. I tried my best to present the information as neutral as possible, but no matter what, you will tick somebody off.
Well, I think, like, one of the perfect examples of, like, the weirdness that comes with that kind of stuff is there was a video you made a while back. I think it's my favorite religion for breakfast video, which is a several century long fight over a ladder.
Yeah, that's the immovable ladder at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. So the Church of the Holy Sepulchre dates back to Constantine. It's a super ancient church, but it's said to have been built over the place where Jesus was crucified and buried. And sometime in the medieval period, I think somebody put up a ladder. It's so random. They put up a ladder to, like, a certain part of the building, and there's debates over who can move it because the church is shared between different Orthodox communities, Christian communities, and so no one has, like, explicit rules to who's allowed to touch it and move it. So little theology quirks that happen like that.
Yeah. All right. I've got for everybody, I have been listening to you in the chat. I just wanted to make sure that gather up a little bit of a buffer of questions before I started taking them, and we've got a few now. So, I don't have to warn you about what you're getting into with my channel.
No, that's fair.
First question, all capital letters with three question marks. Was Jesus a socialist?
Man, you have a political audience. That, I don't know, that'd be anachronistic to use a modern day political. No, I don't think so. He was a apocalyptic Jewish preacher that did have some anti-imperialistic tendencies, possibly wanted to topple Rome. At least some of his followers thought he wanted to. No, I don't think I would use that term just because it would be so anachronistic.
Yeah, I would think that the only, like, modern day person that he would have anything most in common with would be, like, the local person with a sandwich board and a long beard who yells at a popular street corner. Like, that's like,
yeah, like his followers definitely had anti-imperialist tendencies. Like the Book of Revelation, the book that has the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and the 9-headed dragon, which you're talking about. Like, if you read that through the lens of a Jewish author that really hates Rome, the whole book makes sense. So yeah, you can think of him as a preacher living in an oppressed, a territory occupied by Roman barracks everywhere. So whether that makes him a socialist, I don't think so, but it definitely possibly anti-imperialist.
Mm-hmm. All right. The next question. Oh, this is just Spartan 101 asking if I remember him. Yes, I remember you. Don't worry. You're remembered. All right. Terry Weaver. Terry Weaver's got a question for you. Now, this one will expand out because this is, I know, a gigantic can of worms in religious studies. I mean, it's something that's pretty dead, but it's something that I'm sure you're loathed because you probably get this question about every 3 weeks or so. Do you think Jesus was a single real person or a composite of several real or mythical people?
Yeah, this is the whole Christ myth theory. So again, it's opening a can of worms. I can't get into all of the responses to the Christ myth theory. I think he was a actual human being, a Jewish apocalyptic preacher living in the early 1st century CE. And the reason why I think that is because he fits in his historical moment. So people want to make him like this composite of like a Platonic philosopher, or maybe a Cynic philosopher, or then influence from, archangel myths. I don't exactly know all of the arguments, but if you read the Dead Sea Scrolls, which date to the century before and like the decades during Jesus's life, the Dead Sea Scrolls are singing a very similar tune. that the end of the world is coming. You need to purify yourself through water. There's water rituals in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this is all happening in like the Judean desert where John the Baptist was living too. And so then we have a guy named John the Baptist come along, and then we have a guy named Jesus who is somehow affiliated with John the Baptist. So you have this constellation of presumably historical figures, definitely historical figures who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then I don't think anybody disputes that John the Baptist was historical. And then you have Jesus come along, and they're all doing water rituals. They're all talking about the end of the world. So you had this flash in the pan moment of apocalyptic preaching in the first century. And it fits historically. We can see the documents fit. And you don't need to look very far outside of the Judean desert and the texts that were written around there to support it historically. So anybody that has to rely on archetypal myths of dying and rising gods to try to explain Jesus, I'm like, you're working too hard to try to explain what looks like to me facts on the ground, which are texts that were written in the first century, singing a similar tune of what must have been the popular theology of the time. And then my other response to that is the historical model of how new religious movements are formed explains the Jesus movement. It explains the Jesus movement better than archetypal myths and composite myths, because we know how new religious movements are formed. Charismatic people like Joseph Smith in the Mormon tradition, coming along, getting a group and getting that group really excited. And I think that sociological model explains Jesus and the Jesus movement better than like a archetypal myth model.
Yeah. And if anything, the archetypal myth stuff was part of his mythologizing when he was canonized. Like, I don't think any religious scholar would like say that there's not like significant, like, popular mythologies in the period of like Dionysus's miracles and the sort of Zoroastrian significance of the number 12 and with death and resurrection and like even elements. This one I might be wrong on, elements of the sort of concept of the afterlife borrowed from the Egyptians, like just sort of taking it and building it up.
I don't know if it's from the Egyptians necessarily. I mean, it might be. I do a video on the history of hell, which was fun to research, and some of that is from Hellenistic mythology. But I mean, yeah, no one denies that there's been mythologizing of Jesus, even by the time the Gospels were written. Like, people are mythologized all the time. Apollonius of Tyana is a good example too, who's kind of this godlike man who's a philosopher in the 200s, who in later texts came out to be this crazy miracle working philosopher. So mythologizing humans, very common. New religious movement sociological theory explains Jesus better, in my estimation.
Yeah. The other thing I think that mythological Jesus people, the thing that like set them off was like, this is like a thing that is really weird about history. So like medieval scholars who did history back in like the Middle Ages were mostly monks and mostly members of the clergy. And they had a concept of the past that was very different than like one today, because they saw the past very much as like, we started off here and we're moving towards the end of the world. But the big thing that they saw is that, well, we have the a priori knowledge that all the canon is true. And so if the historical documents don't fit it, then we have to just add in the stuff so that it fits canon, because we know that that's true. So we're going that as like the baseline. And so there's a lot of like, I think Josephus is the most famous example of like texts that are like historical secular proofs that there was a Jesus in this period, but then they turned out to be something that like a monk made up like centuries later, because they were just filling in what they thought they knew about the thing. And that,
yeah, I mean, like Josephus is a good example too, where I think he mentions Jesus twice in his text, and at least one of them, the so-called testimonium of Josephus, is like definitely either completely invented as a interpolation from some later monk, or somehow meddled with. But even that, it's not a slam dunk. It seems to be meddled with at least. So the argument is, how meddled with is it? Is it completely spurious, or is it half? If it's half, it's an outside the canon proof of Jesus's historical existence. So in order for the Christ myth theory to be true, you have to get a slam dunk on every single thing. Gospel of Mark, completely spurious. Matthew, completely spurious. The testimony of Josephus, completely spurious. And I just think there's so many slam dunks that need to be done that to me it's a house of cards, like a literal house of cards where you're piling up your argument. And even if one of them is true, okay, he was historical, just super mythologized, the theory falls apart.
Yeah. I mean, we have to know that you have things like the historical fact, which is that we know that Jesus existed because he had a kid, and then the kid went to France, and then they started the Priory of Sion, and and now they hold, what was it, like a nuclear bomb? I can't remember. I don't remember those books very well.
Yeah, we could go all the Mary Magdalene route too.
Oh, the thing is, all right, here's the thing, is that my mom is she's not like this. I don't think she's like this much anymore, but she was like very like into New Age Christian-y stuff. And so I grew up with like oh yeah, Mary Magdalene went to France with a kid, and like, what was the other thing that she was really into? That Jesus went to India to study with Brahmins and brought back like reincarnation.
Yeah.
Like all that kind of New Agey stuff. Like I grew up with that as like my pseudo religious upbringing, because I'd actually never been to church or anything like that. But all right. We could talk about that all day, but the questions are piling up, and I know one is from my wife, so I know if I don't get to that, I'm going to get in trouble. One question we've got, this one seems a little insider baseball, so you might have to explain a bit. Thoughts on Kotsky's The Foundations of Christianity?
Oh, I haven't read it, so quick answer there.
Alrighty. Sorry. All right. Glitch 42. Have you heard of the NGO, the Institute for Global Engagement?
I have not.
All right.
Google it real quick.
Yeah. Sure. All right. We can do the next one real quick, which is from 255 AD. Prolific question asker on this channel. You've pushed back against the idea that religion is disappearing. Do you think that's a good or bad thing, or are you unwilling to make value judgments if religion is good or bad?
I do hesitate to make value judgments any more than someone, because I always say that religion is embedded in culture. It's inseparable from culture. So can we say culture is a good or bad thing? Can we say that language is a good or bad thing? Like it's almost impossible to make a value judgment. People have done some heinously horrible things in the name of religion. They've done heinously horrible things in the name of politics. So it's difficult for me to say blanket statement that religion is a bad thing. Mm-hmm. In the sense of it declining, I've always said that it's not declining, but it's changing in a weird fragmenting sort of way, where at least in the United States and Western Europe, some of the world religions are losing members, but these members still believe in God or gods or life force. So they still believe in religion-y things. And I would still call that falls under the label of religious. So for me, if I could look 300 years into the future, it wouldn't necessarily look like Star Trek, where it's kind of like a-religious. It would look like a very weird amorphous. Everybody has their own individual belief system. Some are in like small, 10 to 20 person cohorts. That's my thesis for the future of religion. So yeah, I mean,
I would say the same thing. Like I think like one of the, now I know there's a social psychologist not far away from me, so if I get hit, you'll know I'm wrong on this. So if I'm under the impression that the number one thing that they thing that they can do to get somebody to commit horrible, heinous acts is that they're doing it for what they consider the greater good. And really, the greater good can be anything from religion to ideology to really like anything. And if you think about all of the mass atrocities in history, it was due to them having some concept of a greater good that they were doing them for.
Yeah. I mean, this is where I like sociology again, because you have this concept of the in-group versus the out-group. And religion is a very useful legitimizing ideology to create an in-group and out-group, the us versus them. So I've always said that religion is a legitimizing ideology for people's violence. Like, oh, I'm going to commit violence. I'm going to use my religion to legitimate that violence. I'm always hesitant to say that it is the cause of people's violence, because the causes that people, the actual impetus for people doing violence is so varied. Sometimes it's because they were recruited by a charismatic terrorist recruiter, or they were influenced by a powerful leader of some sort, and then but it's from my understanding, it's not as common that like, oh, I believe this certain thing, so I'm going to act this certain way. It's usually coming from the group mentality, and that in-group, out-group can come from a lot of different ideologies.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh man. Yeah. If I were to put on like, I really don't want to do this because Sam Harris is such a bad person, but it's just so bad. Just don't do any Sam Harris, anybody, not even once.
I mean, Sam Harris is a good example because he does seem to argue that our beliefs cause us to do things. Oh, I believe I'm going to get this in the afterlife, so I'm going to commit violence. But so I'm really influenced by the scholar Emil Durkheim, who argues that religion is in the group. It's all about the group mentality. So I push back against that thesis and say it's not because this person believes that this is going to happen. The reason they did this is because they were surrounded by other people that were kind of feeding into it. Like, oh, I'm going to do this because brother and sister so and so in my religious cohort wants me to, and so suddenly their actions are driven by their surroundings, not so much by what they're thinking in their head, which is a more Durkheimian approach to religious violence.
Yeah, and if you really think about it, like that implies this concept that like religion is like a thing, like it almost legitimizes the religious idea, because then it externalizes the religion, that it's like the source code that makes people do things, when you don't realize that religion in its continually changing form is always sort of an emergent phenomenon out of the societies that make them. Hence why you can have, like, when your country was debating whether or not black people were people, they had biblical scholars both legitimizing continuing slavery and
abolishing.
Like what's it called? John Brown, one of the greatest abolitionists in American history, who when he was brought to be arrested for basically like illegally freeing a bunch of slaves, he fought the police with a sword, and then basically said that like this country has damned itself and there's no way out of this except for blood or something like that, before he was executed. So it's a thing. All right, this is from House of History. So what convinced you to pursue a PhD in religious studies?
It was actually kind of accidental. I started as a historian, so I sometimes look at step back history with a little bit of nostalgia, because I was a history major in college. I studied classics after college, so I was applying to ancient history programs, and I applied to 13 or 14 PhD programs. 12 of them were history programs. One of them was a religious studies program. I got into 3, and Boston University just seemed to be the best opportunity. They were funding me a little better with the graduate stipend. My graduate advisor at Boston University studied exactly what I was going to study. So I'm like, even though this is a religious studies department, I'm going to take a risk and go here instead of the history department and see what happens. And I've never looked back, because the sort of classes you take in a religious studies a graduate school program is a lot different than a history program. Instead of taking a historiography class, you're taking a cultural theory class with Durkheim and Mary Douglas and all the J.Z. Smith, like all these cultural theorists that write about religion. And I don't want to put words in people's mouth, but I don't think a history program offers those sorts of classes. So I just fell in love with religion as a subject outside of my interest in history.
I will say history has, for the last like maybe 25, 30 years, been dragged kicking and screaming into cultural theory. And it really depends upon whether you are a boomer historian or a Gen X or millennial historian about whether you're cool with theory. But because like I know I got a little bit of it when I was doing my graduate school work, but for the most part, there is sort of a very strong anti-theory concept in the profession, because it's always like this idea that people keep trying to make history a science and fail.
Yeah, though even in your cultural theory classes, you probably were not focusing specifically on religion, right?
No, not really. It was more like trying to use like gender theory to make an analysis of past concepts of gender hierarchies, and as a whole, it was like a trial by fire type thing. But I came from American studies, before I went into history. So I got a lot of the theory in that too. I actually was going to do something kind of religious before I changed but I got halfway through my undergrad and realized that like, oh, if you want to take this program, so what do you need to do? And by the way, I started my undergrad at 22, so I was already behind a little bit. So step one, transfer universities because there's no anthropology program at this university. Step two, learn Spanish back until the 16th century and then learn Castilian before that. Okay. 3, learn Nahuatl, the indigenous language of central Mexico.
Nice.
Which is spoken by extremely remote communities in...
Yeah, to this day.
Yes, but the only place where you can learn it would be to get into, and all history majors will understand how hard this would be, the University of Chicago. So it would be like do a master's at the University of Chicago focused on learning Nahuatl and then go to Harvard Divinity to go study Mesoamerican, pre-Columbian Mesoamerican like religious studies.
With Dr. Carrasco. He's one of the top Mesoamerican religious studies scholars in the world, and he's at HDS. I've always, before I moved out of Boston, I was like, damn it, I missed the chance to interview this guy because I live in Washington, D.C. now, so I missed the chance to interview. He was right down the street from me.
Yeah, David Carrasco is exactly the reason I would want to go. It's like,
yeah, I would love to do a series on Mesoamerican religion. Like that's written in my editorial calendar, and I just keep putting it off.
Please copy me in on that because I love that shit so much.
Definitely.
I was going to study the evolution of human sacrifice as a religious ritual and how it evolved from like this small thing to like a central pillar of their religious belief based on the El Nino cycle. But that's its own thing.
That's interesting.
Well, like they believed because it was they believed that they had to do it for the gods to be happy enough to give them the things they needed to go. And if you live in Mexico, in central Mexico, you'll know that the El Nino effect is pretty strong there, and it can lead to some really bad years of drought. Yeah. And so it kind of shaped their culture into believing that like the gods can be very, very wrathful. And if you think about it, all of the most like doom and gloom, like blood and destruction religions are from like very harsh climates. Like I think that like the fact the Abrahamic faith comes from the desert kind of says something. Just like how I think that Dune actually covers that quite a bit because the religion of the Fremen who like live on this desert planet becomes super hardcore. Because, all right, this is a fun one. I've heard that so this is from Only Bro 555. I heard that the Book of Lilith was rejected from Bible canon. Why was that, and what is the Book of Lilith?
I don't actually know about the Book of Lilith. I mean, I know Lilith, the character, is kind of like a demon queen of sorts. But in terms of books that were rejected, I'm actually not sure if that was one of them. Do you know anything about this, Tristan?
The only thing I know about Lilith is that, and this is what I think it is, I could be wrong, you might have to do some homework, friends, but that Lilith is, in extremely early Judaism, the name that they gave Eve.
I think she was originally supposed to be married to Adam and then somehow was rejected, and then it was Eve instead. I think that's my understanding of the Lilith myth. But
she refused to be submissive in sex and was exiled from Eden for that. And like that's like, but like that disappears from Jewish canon pretty early on.
Yeah, I'm reading the Wikipedia article right now just to look for the actual text. I don't actually think there's a Book of Lilith. I'll be happily corrected if so. The books that almost made it in are pretty standard. The Didache, the Shepherd of Hermas, these almost made it in, but were rejected either because they weren't popular enough or because some church council didn't like it. And when you read them, it kind of makes sense. Like the Shepherd of Hermas is just as weird as the Book of Revelation, but the Book of Revelation had the added benefit of people thought the Apostle John wrote it. So as soon as it was attached to that name, people were like, we should accept it because John wrote it. Shepherd of Hermas, people are like, who the hell is this Hermas guy? He's no apostle. So it kind of lost its mojo. So of all the books that almost made it, Shepherd of Hermas is the one. I'm not familiar with the Book of Lilith. I almost made it.
Yeah, me neither. What do you make of the hypothesis? This is from 255 AD. What do you think? What do you make of the hypothesis that societies tend towards monotheism as they get more advanced? I alluded to that idea in the alternate history stream on the other week. So there's like this idea that like this is sort of an outdated thing in, I think, comparative anthropology, but the idea that like religions start more animist and they sort of as they become more centralized and urban, they develop into also cat.
Yeah, this is James Frazer, from my understanding. James Frazer's book, The Golden Bough. This is his argument that it goes from animist to polytheist to monotheist, and then for him, at least as far as I know from The Golden Bough, his final stage is science. It goes animism, polytheism, monotheism, science, and then like humanity has graduated from monotheism. I'm trying to think. I don't know if we could say that monotheism is like a higher evolutionary form, because in terms of sheer number of humans, like all of the Indian subcontinent, at least the people that are Buddhists and Hindus there are not traditional monotheists in that sense. China is largely non-religious with some Chinese folk religion thrown in there. So like some huge swaths of humanity have not achieved monotheism. I think a lot of people would say Frazer's argument was imperialistic, where he was like this European looking back at these, Australian Aborigines, calling them savages and saying they haven't yet attained monotheism. So there is kind of a latent racism to the theory too. There's this whole methodological problem of studying cultures like the Australian Aborigines and thinking of them as a window into 100,000 years ago, as if these people aren't living in modernity, as if these people didn't live, tens of thousands of years, and their culture changing over thousands of years. So a lot of these guys, Durkheim included, I like Durkheim, but his methodology was messed up because he looked at the Australian Aborigines and he was like, primitive religion is right there. We can study it. And it's like, well, maybe their religion was different 50,000 years ago. You're just studying them in the 1920s,
Yeah. I think I can't remember the details of this exact conversation he's referring to, but I think I was saying something around the lines of like, it's like a urbanization thing that like, that centralized bureaucracies prefer fewer and fewer gods.
That's an interesting argument. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's probably some interesting arguments for why so many people are monotheistic now, like why Christianity and Islam have kind of become the first and second biggest religions. But I would sooner point to like political reasons than some sort of evolutionary reason, cultural evolution.
Yeah, I think if I could make a guess, it would be that monotheism as a concept, because it is like polytheism had like in its history, it could be they could live for long periods of time, because like if I have gods and you have different gods and we invade you and take you over, like you just like, all right, like we don't like, they're not necessarily like those gods don't exist. It's just like those are their gods. And you see this often in like Mesoamerica, where like they would take over a city state and they'd be like, all right, you have to like add our god to your pantheon. Or like how there was a lot of Greek Egyptian syncretism and things like that.
Yeah, this happened in Rome too, where they had this ritual of calling out the opposing city's god. The legionnaires would show up in front of a opposing city, call out the god, and then attack the city, and then add that god to their pantheon. But even in the Greco-Roman world, there were monotheists. They would say, "Oh, there's only one god, the Platonic one." But all the different gods, Zeus, Apollo, Athena, are manifestations of the one. So even in the so-called polytheistic Roman Empire, you had monotheists. So it's not such a clear-cut pathway of cultural evolution that James Frazer wants us to believe.
Yeah. And then there's the fact that like the first, at least the number one most popular religion was the religion that is explicitly is one of the few religions that's explicitly based on expansion, and was the religion behind the continent that decided to conquer and subjugate most of the planet. So like that's a pretty quick way to spread your faith.
Yeah, that's why like there's got to be a political reason too. You know, even like the British Empire, it's hard to. I'd love to see the change in people calling themselves monotheists before the British Empire and after. You know, stuff like that. Just in the same way that English has spread as the lingua franca, I would hazard a guess that religion was wrapped up in that too.
Yep. Is the theory of Buddhist influences on Jesus taken seriously in the academic studies?
No, I would say no.
Yeah.
If anything that's taken seriously, it's possibly Hellenistic influence. This region was thoroughly Hellenized. You had Jewish cities with Greek theaters and Greek style of government. So like your Jewish rabbi could go to the local theater on the weekends and watch a Greek show. So like Jesus might have been influenced by that in some respect, but you don't need to look too far from first century Judaism to explain his thinking. It's like all there in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's all over the New Testament.
Not to mention to like have gone to India and come back would have been like quite an exceptional feat for someone like him to have done.
Yeah.
Like that is quite a journey to make it that far.
Yeah. I would sooner point to Zoroastrianism too. I mean, you had, Zoroastrians appear in the New Testament. They're the Magi that come from the East, watching the stars. So there's probably some influence there, but that would be Persian, Iranian. That wouldn't be Buddhist.
Yeah. Oh, I would also add on the talk about like how in sort of older religions there was more like of an acceptance that other gods existed, just kind of in weird other forms. I will point to this book called Exodus, in which it basically shows that the Egyptian gods are real, just that they're weaker than Yahweh. There's a scene where Moses's staff turns into a serpent, and then the Egyptian staffs turn into serpents, and 2 versus 1, but the Yahweh serpent kills the other ones, which kind of implies that my God's stronger than your God type thing.
Especially in the Hebrew Bible, we can't use the word monotheism. The Israelites in the Old Testament are not monotheists. They're what would be called monolatrous. They worship one God, but they don't necessarily believe only one God exists. And there are scripture passages all throughout the Hebrew Bible that says Yahweh's more powerful than all the other gods. And they're not using a metaphor there. They're being literal. They're like, we believe that multiple gods exist. Yahweh's just the strongest. So if we really want to be technical, monolatry is the right term to describe that religion, not monotheism.
Yeah, someone just said monolatry. All right, this one comes from Kelly Barnes, my wife, who's just in the next room. Mm-hmm. What role do you think religion plays in society, and how do we fill that role in our time of increasing secularism?
Yeah, that's such a tough question. There's a scholar who's a good friend and colleague named Connor Wood, who I've interviewed on the channel before, who writes a lot about this, where religion fills, thinking from a Durkheimian perspective, it fills this social role of like a social glue between people. It lends people a sense of purpose, like, oh, I have a role in my community, whether that's a deacon or a pastor or a layperson. Like it feels you're given a sense of purpose and social glue and obligation. You have an obligation to your community. So lacking all that, I think people have reached out for ways to find that social glue outside of religious communities. Another friend of mine at Yale Divinity School is doing her research on Soul Cycle, the workout group Soul Cycle, and how it's kind of religious-y, where it's like you band together and inspire each other to work out. And even that name, Soul Cycle, like it has like this transcendent idea. So can it be replaced? I think so. People have found ways to replace religion, and it's usually social. It's usually in groups, and I think it usually has some sort of obligation to the group. And I think exercise clubs is one way to look at it. I think ethics societies, where you show up to a place to talk about a book or an idea on a weekly basis, can fill that role.
Yeah, and I don't know if you have it in America, but we have the United Church in Canada, which has no explicit spiritual beliefs, but has like a clergy and has temples and things like that.
Yeah, there's one in Boston too. I think it meets on Harvard's campus. It's basically an atheists group that show up on Sundays and have an atheist church. They sing songs together, they have an ethical sermon, but it's completely non-spiritual, non-transcendent, non-supernatural. So these fill that role that religion has, but it's not at scale. This is my big question. It's not at scale. It's not like the Roman Catholic Church, which just has hundreds and hundreds of parishes and a hierarchy and a network. So this is why I say that the future of religion looks so much more fragmented, because I don't think we're going to have systems. We're going to have small niche communities. But honestly, that's probably what religion was like 50,000 years ago in prehistoric times. You had these small tribal groups that probably each had their own god or their own ancestral spirit. So we still have that biology of being a tribal species. So I think there's always the impetus to finding a tribe, and that tribe doesn't necessarily need to be a system, a religious system, or a global religion. That's kind of unique, I think, in the last 500, 600 years.
Yeah. So short answer, Soul Cycle or book club or D&D. Those are the answers. Those are the three.
There we go. That's our theory of everything.
Yep. All right. Thoughts on the religious movement / semi called Falun Gong and Falun Dafa? Do you know about these?
I know about Falun Gong is, I thought, how it was spelled, but I know so little about it. I can't speak about it with any expertise. It's a religious / social movement in China. I saw them everywhere in Boston. They would show up on MIT's campus with a big sign that says Falun Gong is great. That's all the sign says. Falun Gong is great. Like, oh, great. That's awesome.
That's right.
I don't know enough about it. I know that they're persecuted by the Chinese government as some sort of subversive group, even though it strikes me as kind of like a spiritual health and wellness movement, where you're trying to like find meditative peace of some sort. But it's worth a video. I've yet to do the video, but they're huge, tens of millions, because China's population is so huge. So even if a small percentage is part of this group, it's tens of millions of people. So I think it's understudied. The fact that tens of millions of people subscribe to this and no one knows what it is pretty weird.
Yeah, I just oh, I completely lost my train of thought there. Sorry.
That's fine. I'm Googling. Falun Gong is a spiritual practice. See, even Wikipedia doesn't call it a religion. I know it's a movement, but I don't know if we can call it a religion.
Well, there we go. Question answered definitively. We're really good at this.
I'm sorry, everybody. So I will say that my expertise is demonology and magical practice in the late Roman Empire. So that, if you ask me questions about that, I can pull it out of my brain. If you ask me questions about Chinese religious social movements from the 20th century, I will try my best, but I can't. I'm not an encyclopedia.
I will also say, like, every YouTuber has, as you were talking, like, it's like an idea on your list. Every YouTuber I know has hundreds of videos that they would like to make that are sitting in a gigantic document.
Yeah,
that they're just waiting to make someday.
That is me. I call it my editorial calendar. It's like my best chance at trying to get a video out every week is on this calendar, and I always fall behind the schedule.
Mm-hmm. All right. Why do you think that most religions have a concept of eternal peace and pleasure in one realm and eternal torture and damnation in another? That's from Black Phantom 929. I'm not exactly. I think that's not exactly true, is it?
No, I wouldn't say so. I mean, unless I'm misunderstanding Buddhism and Hinduism, where you have this cycle of samsara, where you are trying to break the cycle of samsara to reach nirvana, but I don't think there's an actual punishment by staying in samsara. Like, samsara is the punishment, the cycle of rebirth and death. But you might be reborn as a human and then reborn as a cow, but it's not necessarily suffering. I think we're thinking of Christianity, and I think Islam also has a concept of hell. Where it's highly dualistic, pleasure in heaven, damnation in the afterlife. I'd love an explanation on why. It might go back to what you were saying, Tristan, about certain religions just being kind of rough. The concept of hell is kind of, it's monstrous in some respects. People always say, oh, the God in the Hebrew Bible is the mean God. He's the God that smites people, and the God in the New Testament's the nice God. And I'm like, I don't know if that's true, because in the New Testament, that's when hell comes around, and that's pretty That's pretty rough.
And that's what evangelicals use that line a lot. Like, that's why, like, isn't he so nice? He sacrificed his own son, who is also him, but so that he could get over how mad he is at you for someone like 20 generations back doing something. I'm not exactly sure how it works. The logic of all of that is, I don't think, super important, but
I think my sense, so going back to religion being an obligation to the society, you know, having a concept of eternal damnation has a social purpose of helping people's, you know, driving people to live morally. Oh, I can't end up in hell, so I have to try to live morally. So, and at least the concept of hell that is borrowed from Hellenistic thought, it's based off of morality. So in Plato's Republic, the people that kind of go through the experience of hell are the bad people. So it is kind of a shuffling of humanity between those who live right and those who live wrongly, even though officially in Christian theology, you know, everybody has lived wrongly and you need Jesus to come and sacrifice himself to take the punishment for you. So
we'll say during the spiritual conquest of Mexico, that was the thing that that was really poignant, is that they were able to be like, wait, this is a God that sacrificed itself for us. That's like a complete reversal of the way that things are supposed to run. And that was actually like one of the things that really, at least that's what they say, they got that really helped them convince them.
Yeah, the thing is, like Christianity is so diverse. Even concepts of hell differ between Eastern Orthodox groups and Roman Catholic groups. So it's hard to say that there's this one definitive answer, like this is why hell was a thing. But the fact that it's so wrapped up with morality does make me think. I mean, that's a difference from Judaism, where you could become ritually impure in Judaism from things that are just normal. You touch a dead body, you become ritually impure, but that's not immoral. It's just impure. But sometime in the 1st century, with the Jesus movement, impurity started to get wrapped up with morality as well. You get baptized not just to get rid of impurity, but to get rid of immorality. You become, pure to enter the kingdom of heaven. So the whole Jesus movement, I think, is more inflected with morality, more so than what we saw with Judaism before it.
Yeah, kind of is. Yeah, there's interesting stuff to that, because like I recently, or I will soon, February, friends, have a video coming out about birth control and abortion. And one of the things that was the thing is that like the concept of like religious reasons for being pro-life and stuff are actually pretty new, because like in the past a lot of people were convinced that babies were kind of evil because they still had the original sin and they hadn't been saved yet, so they were still like a little bit evil, and so it wasn't so bad.
And I always say that religions change over time. So whenever we think of abortion and Christians, we think, oh, Christians are against abortion. But when you think historically, in the 1970s, the Southern Baptist Convention supported abortion. Go back and read their minutes from the Southern Baptist Convention's meeting notes in the 1970s, and they come out and say, oh, we support it in certain situations. Imagine a Southern Baptist saying that today in 2019. So even in just 40 years, we see change in theology, change in religious practice, let alone, 1,500 years of history.
All right, Emperor Alexander. Tristan, did you know that the majority of the founding fathers were deists? Yes. It was the popular deist was the atheist of like the intellectual dark web of the 18th century.
Dude, that's a good title. Intellectual dark web of the 1700s.
Yeah, because they were all like the people who wanted to feel superior to others because of how not religious they were, and so deism was there.
That's funny.
All right, Wolframium, fill the gaps. Shema Israel Adonai Eloheinu Adonai blank.
I think he's trying to determine if I'm Jewish. I think that's the Shema, but I'm not sure. I'm not. I don't know a lick of Hebrew, so I'm sorry. I know how to say thank you because I was in Jerusalem for 6 months.
All right. By the way, I'm trying to get people's questions. I'm getting a lot of them, and because everybody wants to pick your brain, it's a pretty good brain. So when they get your ear for just a little bit, they're going crazy. So another question for Andrew, is bullfighting a reminiscence of some ancient Mediterranean ritual?
Okay, so we have that one fresco from Knossos on Crete of bull jumpers. I'm sure you're familiar with that, Tristan.
This is actually all new to me. I'm sadly ignorant, so I'm learning.
Okay, there's a pretty famous fresco from Crete of Minoans like jumping over bulls. I don't think it's bull fighting. It looked like bull leaping of some sort. You also might the commenter also might be thinking about the bull sacrifice, where there's this idea of like sacrificing a bull and letting the blood drench down on top of you. That's actually not as historically attested as we like to think. Like there's not much there's textual evidence for it, but the textual evidence I think is from early Christian writers trying to say how gross the Greeks and Romans were. So it's like highly biased. There was definitely bull sacrifice where they were barbecuing a bull in front of the temples.
Yeah, isn't bull sacrifice like a barbecue?
It's a barbecue. It was essentially a barbecue, and the meat was distributed to the people watching. So like the priest would get the best cut, but if you were there nearby, you would get a cut of meat, which was super rare for a peasant in the Greco-Roman cities. So again, religion being a social experience. But the bull was killed in a very highly ritualized manner, throat slash, it was clubbed on the head first. So whether we can call that bullfighting, the thing's tied up. Yeah, I would be I don't know enough about the Iberian Peninsula and the Roman Empire to know if like Spanish bullfighting dates back to the Roman period, but at least in the Roman period that I know, which is mostly Eastern Mediterranean, it wasn't really the word fight would be too much. It was a ritualized slaughter.
I would also say that actually that the writing about how gross it was happens a lot. I always go to the example that I read up about, and that was they did that to the Mesoamericans about cannibalism. They did that to a lot of Native Americans about cannibalism, actually.
Yeah, I will say I do have 2 videos on the history of animal sacrifice, and it was inspired by one of my Greco-Roman religion classes where we watched an animal get slaughtered. We watched a little goat get its head chopped off at a temple in India, and I almost passed out in class. I'm this, pansy American that's never seen an animal killed in his life because I buy meat from the grocery store packaged in vacuum sealed packages. So to watch a goat get its head chopped off during a ritual sacrifice, I almost passed out. And I'm like, dude, this was the daily experience of people throughout most of history, and definitely in the period of history that I study, which is the Roman period, where they were killing animals left and right. So it was just kind of this pathetic experience of this Roman historian sitting there analyzing the animal as it gets head chopped off, and I can't even deal. I have to close my eyes.
Yeah. Oh man, there's a term, I think it's from the Hardcore History podcast, which is like the past is another planet.
Mm-hmm.
Which the more you study it, the more you realize it's so true.
Yeah.
All right, 255 AD is asking, a rabbi once told me that every Torah ever written is exactly the same. IRL, how long have Torah has all been exactly the same?
That sounds like a theological statement. I don't think they're all the same. I mean, the Dead Sea Scrolls have slight differences from the Masoretic text. So up until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, most of our Hebrew Bibles were based off of what's called the Masoretic text, which was like the official Hebrew Bible text from the late early medieval period. I think it dates like 700s or 800s. But then we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, and suddenly we have these big copies of Leviticus or whatever that are different linguistically. I mean, like, not huge differences, but I far be it for me to disagree with a rabbi, but I think that sounds more of a theological argument than a actual philological historical argument.
All right, Wolframium. Andrew, what do you think of the Druze? Have you ever met one?
I'm sure I came in contact with some when I was in Israel. I don't know enough. I wish I did. This is a video that many of my subscribers have asked for, and usually when I make these videos I learn myself. Like, I don't know enough about the Druze. It's a religious minority in Israel. A lot of them serve in the Israel Defense Force because they can serve on the Sabbath. So what a great way to get your security force out on a day when some people don't want to work. But yeah, I wish I knew more.
What can you tell us? All right, this is from Chris. Oh, this is a very, you were saying like late Roman Empire, Christos Nikolaou. Very Byzantine name there. What can you tell us about the audiences that each gospel was written for?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, usually, so first of all, an elite audience. I mean, these texts, think about it. They're written in Greek, so they're not written in Aramaic. So they're not for an Aramaic audience. They're for a Greek reading audience. So we sometimes forget how highly educated how these gospel writers must have been, enough to write an entire text like this. And the Gospel of John, heavily influenced by Greek philosophy with this whole logos theology. So number one, an elite audience. Number two, a Greek reading audience, probably outside of the Levant. Specifically, I mean, they always say that Matthew is the most Jewish of them all. Jesus is kind of portrayed as a new Moses. Matthew kind of has these natural breaks that break it into 5 parts. So some people argue that it's kind of meant to be a mirror of the Torah. Luke is sometimes thought of as the more Gentile-friendly gospel. I don't know how much that argument holds water. I mean, all of them are kind of Gentile-friendly as Greek written, text written in Greek for an elite audience. And then John is written for people that really want the more mystic Jesus. Jesus is a mystic in the Gospel of John. He's kind of floating around. He doesn't seem quite as what's the word? Emotional. Like even on the cross in the Gospel of John, he's like, just let this happen to me. I'm just going to keep saying wise things from the cross, compared to Mark, where he's like literally screaming out in pain.
Or the Gospel of Mel, in which he it's just extremely bloody and brutal and terrible.
Yeah.
God, that movie is so bad.
So, I mean, not many people could read back then. It was a semi-literate society. So when we theorize about the audience, I got to imagine it must have been like philosophical book club among, Roman elites, which is an interesting, it's not what you think. You usually think of Christians like hiding in their house churches, avoiding persecution. But St. Paul in the Book of Corinthians mentions a woman named Chloe, who presumably was a wealthy woman, wealthy enough to have a house big enough to house the Corinthian house church. So even by the 50s, when Paul was writing, Christianity had penetrated enough wealthy people, wealthy families, that it must have had an audience of literate elites reading these gospels, writing them, copying them, and sharing them. So the whole idea of like Christianity being like a peasant's religion shared only among the peasants, I think is spurious, because we don't appreciate the low literacy rates of the time.
Mm-hmm. Does that mean that possibly that these books were written in a way to be read aloud?
Yeah, well, that would be the next thing, and this is kind of goes into my own research, where in a semi-literate society, where would you have experienced these gospels? You would have experienced them read to you orally, either in a house church reading situation, or your literate friend reading it for you, but then you're not reading it in its entirety. You're just getting bits and pieces of it. Maybe the Lord's Prayer, like really famous parts that ended up being super famous. So yeah, you would have only experienced it orally for 90% of the population.
Is that why it's maybe so episodic? Like why it's so like broken into like parables and stories? And
that's a good question. I mean, the parables are definitely oral experiences. The prayers, Mary has a big prayer. Jesus has several prayers. Yeah, I mean, so from my own research of ancient Christian magic, certain passages become magical. You get the Lord's Prayer on amulets, and you wear the amulet around your neck. So in my own theorizing, this I don't know how much I can back this up without actually citing the data. I think people latched on to certain passages. Oh, I heard that passage in the house church meeting last week, and that's the one I want on my amulet when I'm afraid of being attacked by demons. Because we live in a mostly literate society, I don't think we think deeply about how these texts would have been experienced. And it would have been experienced in small buildings with a person reading it to you, and you would have never just gotten the whole thing.
And that's another thing where like the people who are super duper literal about the Bible, or like people who, like a lot of critics of Christianity who point out that they're like, oh, you're not following every single rule. It's like, well, it was never really, nobody ever gets the full
Yeah, I mean,
experience.
like the four gospels themselves contradict in some ways because, I mean, we can imagine society, like communities that didn't have all four gospels. They maybe only had Mark, or they maybe only had John. So this was pre-canon, and no one was trying to harmonize them until decades later.
My copy of Luke got broken, so we just read from the other three.
Yeah.
Like, yeah. All right. Yeah. Because another thing to mention in that period is that books are really, really expensive back then. And so you might have had like people who are like, oh, well, the first half of my Mark is ruined. So I got the second half and I kind of scribbled my shopping list on some of them and like,
Yeah,
like
no,
that.
for sure. I mean, they're expensive. They're rare. Your whole community might have just one copy of this one text, and sure as hell hope it doesn't, rip in half or fall apart or get rained on, because that's expensive stuff to fix.
Yeah. Thoughts on the Immaculate Birth story as cover-up of infidelity or rape? This comes from the Hindu god Kali.
I mean, it's speculative. How do we support that historically? We have this story. So from my understanding, I'm not Catholic either, so I don't really know. I think the Immaculate Conception refers to Mary and being conceived, not Jesus being conceived in Mary. So if we're talking about Mary and Jesus, I mean, it's a speculative explanation, sure. We were talking earlier about Jesus being mythologized throughout his life. So you could say, oh yeah, there was a guy named Joseph and a woman named Mary, and they had a kid named Jesus who then became mythologized. So we had to retcon his immaculate or his miraculous conception.
It does seem like a way that they would like post hoc because there's the whole like there's a long debate about whether Jesus was a divine figure, was like the literal son of God or a prophet, and I can imagine that would be like a post hoc edit to.
So here, let me get on my soapbox for a bit.
All right.
People in the sciences are always like data. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That's what Richard Dawkins always says. It's the same with history and archaeology, and a claim requires data. So when I say certain passages from the scripture probably were experienced orally, I have to support that with evidence. So certain amulets have mistakes, spelling mistakes that appear to be mistakes made by someone thinking about it orally and not reading it off of a page. There's my data supporting my thesis. So if our thesis is the story of Mary being conceived with Jesus was a cover-up for possible rape or marital infidelity, the next question should be, okay, there's your claim, where's the evidence? And any evidence has to be speculative, or you have to reach into other parallel texts from the Eastern Mediterranean in the first century that are similar, where a woman.
Oh no, Andrew. No, we lost Andrew on his soapbox. Well, hello, friends. While we wait for Andrew to come back while he's mid-anger, I'll entertain questions that are not to him. While he finds his way home, he just got smoten. Okay. Oh, poor guy. All right, I'm going to. All right, if he can get back, hopefully Andrew can get back. Will you smoke on stream? Probably not. And Tristan is dead and I have killed him. Sorry. Oh man. Can you answer this question? Yes, I can, Cooper. Consider it answered. Hopefully we get Andrew home back soon. This is some good stuff. And also you guys can entertain, there's a cat right over here. Looks like Andrew has lost his Wi-Fi. So his Wi-Fi apparently went down. I will see what we can do. Hi, Tristan would be fun. The closest I've ever come to hi, Tristan was probably this Tuesday where I was like, I was kind of just really tired and really checked out, and I just ended up acting like a weirdo for a couple hours. I'll come back to the stream to hear the rest of Andrew's soapbox. All right, good stuff. Did you make it to Venezuela AMA on BreadTube? No, I did not. How is your day? It's all right so far. Have you played in No Mean? I don't know what that is, so no. What will the USA look like in the next 100 years politically? It's going to change quite a bit, or it's going to cease to exist, along with the rest of the planet. The big things you can point out are that while demographics are changing, if you're looking at 100 years, the United States is going to be going through climate catastrophes. They're going to go. They're a country of 300 plus million people that have mass desertification happening in the center of the country, and the southern United States is getting more and more volatile. So it's going to be much less inhabitable, and there's going to be a lot of people, which makes me think that there's going to be a bit of a rough situation. And also, it's probably not going to be the political and economic hegemon that it is now. It's got like things like the BRICS countries taking off and things like that. So there's all sorts of there's this idea that as climate change makes the world less and less inhabitable, that we're going to go through something called I see an empty chair. Oh God. Big crashing sound. Are you okay? We saw an empty chair and a bunch of big crashing sound, and we don't know what happened.
Am I back?
Yes, you are back.
Oh my gosh. Sorry about that.
Are you all right? We heard a big crash.
Yeah, I'm fine.
All right. So you were ranting.
I was ranting. Support.
People said you got smoten.
I did get smoten, yeah. I've been de-smoten. Resurrected.
Yep, there you go.
When did I cut out?
You cut out when you were talking about extraordinary claims requiring extraordinary evidence, and about how the idea that like immaculate conception would be a cover up for rape would require
data. I mean, that's my soapbox. Where I think you would appreciate this as a historian. We in the humanities just get shit on all the time when we with theories where it's like, oh, this must have happened because I want to believe that it happened. I'm like, well, we have to support it with evidence. I think it's perfectly plausible that this story from the New Testament might have been influenced by some actual peasant woman that got pregnant outside of wedlock somehow, but it's speculation.
Definitely after the Immaculate Conception, there are a lot of times when that happened.
Yeah, again,
art history,
plausible but requires data.
Mm-hmm. All right. This one you can totally give a hard pass on. Someone asked if you have religious beliefs and if what they are, or if you belong to any religious group.
Yeah, this is a question I get daily on my channel. What I usually say is I was raised in the evangelical world, so conservative Christianity. I'm no longer that. I don't know what to call myself. I think agnostic and atheist is too strong of a word. I don't know what to call myself. I'm just like ex-Christian in some respect.
Can I pitch one to you?
Sure.
Apatheist.
I kind of like that.
This is a form of agnosticism that I have subscribed to, and I think my some other people, and it is basically taking the agnostic position that you can't know whether or not a God exists, and then going, also, it doesn't particularly matter to me. It doesn't, whether or not a God exists wouldn't affect my life in either way. I don't really feel like if a God does exist that we automatically need to follow that God's rules. And in my mind, it's just not a thing that I need to factor in my everyday life.
Yeah, I like that. But part of the reason why I don't talk about it as much is for professional reasons, where if I came out as, oh, I'm a Christian or I'm an atheist, suddenly I'm part of one of those communities, and people start wondering, oh, is his channel coming from this religious or non-religious bias? To which I say, check my data. Going back to my soapbox, you could be a super Christian and still be a good historian if you follow the data and support your arguments. You can be an atheist studying religion and not be biased by your atheism. You have to be aware of your biases, be aware of your ideologies, but as long as you're transparently supporting your arguments with evidence, I don't think it matters. And so part of my whole channel's shtick is performing that, where it's like, hey, my own personal religious beliefs don't come into this channel at all. And that's purposeful. I'm just showing interesting aspects of human culture, making arguments on it based off of anthropological and sociological data. And let's think about it, because this is interesting. So many people want me to turn into like a atheist screed channel. And I'm just like, I'm not going to do that. I'm sorry.
I personally live in perpetual fear of the demiurge. So
as every good Gnostic should.
Yes. Do modern movements that claim to revive ancient religions tend to mangle the historical facts pretty badly, or generally get things right? It's from Dorian Sapien.
Yeah, mangle's a really hard term. I would say they are essentially new religious movements. So a lot of movements, kind of like Wicca or neo-pagan movements, they draw inspiration from these ancient groups. I have a hard time calling them anything but new religious movements, because I mean, I do have a friend that watches the show that is a modern day Hellenist. Like, he worships the 12 gods of the Greek pantheon, and he would say there's a historical tie to the Greeks of Plato's era. But it really depends on what we mean by historical continuity. How much continuity is there between Christianity today and St. Paul's time? If Paul walked into a church today, he would be like, what is going on? Like, why are you singing these weird songs? And what's this Bible thing you have? We didn't have a Bible when I was preaching. So, like, can we say there's continuity there? Sure, there's some level of continuity, but they're very different. So the same would go with people that worship Zeus today and Plato and his group worshiping Zeus back then. I think there's at least some sort of mythological continuity. They're using the same myths and stories about the gods, but ritual practice is different. There's some sort of disappearance. I don't know how many neo-pagans were existing in the 1700s or 1800s, or if this was a uniquely 20th century religion. So all that to say, I call them new religious movements, but they might take issue with that. I would have to think more. I would love to hear their arguments how it's not a new religious movement and that it's a continuous religious tradition from Greek times.
Mm-hmm. I'm just trying. I want to meet this neo-Hellenist, and I want to talk about swans.
Yeah, I mean, oh yeah, it's consent and swans.
Consent and swans. That sounds like something that would be at a. That sounds like a conference paper.
That's a video topic right there. That's a video. That's a YouTube title.
I believe in one of 12 gods, and one of them is super horny.
Yeah,
for birds.
For birds, and everything.
and rocks.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
All right. Can you make a video? This is just a flat out request from Emperor Alexander. Can you make a video about the religions that of the indigenous Native Americans openly practiced before the colonization of the Americas?
Oh, I'd love that.
That'd be fun.
I'd love that. I mean, these are topics that are just understudied, even in my own field. They're just understudied. A lot of it's because we don't have much data. So most of the texts we have are post-Spanish conquest or post-English conquest. If you want to study Aztec religion and not have texts that were influenced by some Spanish monk writing it, good luck. You have to rely on hieroglyphics from Mayan ruins.
And there's 4 that remain.
And there's so you're relying entirely on archaeological data and anthropological data. So
yeah.
It's and for North American Indian populations, then you're just completely at the mercy of archaeology and anthropology. So it's a fascinating field, but it's fascinating because it's so mysterious and understudied. So yes, I would love to do that.
That was why I was supposed to learn 16th century Castilian.
Right, exactly.
All right. But if the greater good is based on religion, okay, this is like a kind of follow up of a question we did a while back. Do you think the Romans were evil? I did a presentation in school on the Punic Wars, and what they did during the Third Punic War was atrocious. This is from Sir Zhao Zhao.
So, yeah, I'll speak from my own personal opinions. I don't know if this is a scholarly opinion, but yeah, they were evil. They were slave owners. They had the most heinous, unfair justice system ever, where the more money you had, I mean, this is still true today, but like it was actually in the law books back then. Pick up any Roman law book and it says, if you're part of the elite, you just get exiled to an island. But if you're a peasant, you shall have your head chopped off. So, heinous justice system, brutal conquering of other countries, other people groups, slave owners. Yeah, let's call the Roman Empire an evil totalitarian government for what it was.
Yeah, and also to be fair, like you could say the same of a lot of historical countries. Like really, anytime anyone asks me like, where would you want to live in the past? It's like, you know what?
Today. I'm doing just fine today in the 21st century. Thank you very much.
I like the idea where it's not like Rome, where if you haven't murdered somebody, you're considered a wimp. Like I like this.
I mean, yeah, people are like, oh, wouldn't you love to go live in the Roman times? I'm like, I'd want to live in the Roman times for one day to take like ethnographic notes and then get the hell out of there, because I like flushing toilets. I like electricity. I like not getting dysentery and parasites in my body. Like, thank you.
And antibiotics.
Yeah.
All right. Have you read any of Ontology? This is from Christos Nicolaou, our Byzantine noble. Have you read any ontology theory? Mainly it's used in South American ethnographies and archaeology, and it's quite intriguing. Do you know about this ontology theory?
If it's what he's talking about, yes, and my entire dissertation's influenced by it.
Okay, well
then. So it's what you're thinking. Okay, I'm still here. Good. I thought it froze again. So the idea is that there are different ontologies. In the sense of you have human agents, you have object agents. So the fact that this soda can is shaped in a certain way, it's exerting agency in the sense that I have to interact with it in a certain way, which is hold it like this, use it like this. So me and all my power as a human is completely and utterly influenced by these other ontologies, objects, animals, the space that I walk through. And it's kind of influenced by what would be called new animism, which is thinking of ancient societies as animistic in the sense of objects have power, and power that can exert its influence on you. So when you study magic like myself, and you pick up an amulet that has a certain prayer on it, and you think of that prayer as an oral pronouncement that Jesus himself said, you can say that those words have power, and that power is held in this object. And so this object has agency over me. So that's my understanding of what would be called ontology theory in some respects. And it's highly influential in Native American and South American Indian research, because these communities were very animist, where you had spirits everywhere and spirits that could be in objects. So a lot of religious studies and anthropologists that study these cultures are influenced by this method. It's not necessarily a theory as much as it's a method on how you think about objects and how you study objects as an archaeologist. So I think that's what you're talking about, Nicolaou. I'm sorry if you're thinking of a different ontology theory. But I find it as a helpful lens, putting on the goggles of ontology theory, looking at ancient Christianity, and it helps you think about ancient Christian objects in a different way. Objects that hold power, that made these people think, oh, if I have this around my neck, it will keep demons away from me. It's a fun way to think about ancient magic.
Yeah, I actually, I didn't specifically refer to it, but it makes a lot of sense with the research I did on voodoo, where like they would do like things, they would make things like, and this actually fits quite interestingly with the stuff you were saying, that even though they were a Christian movement, because they had sort of syncretically absorbed so much in West Africa, that they would wear these talismans that had like excerpts from the Quran on it.
Yeah,
and these were ostensibly Christians who believed that like the words of the Quran on the talisman had like certain type of powers.
There's Muslims in Sudan that would write Quranic verses on paper and then wash off the ink into water and then drink the water.
Huh.
And
That's
that's
kind of cool.
magical healing, which is interesting because that's the ink that was written as a verse. Then you wipe it off and imbibe it, and that's thought to heal you. So again, it's not the power of the words is not in your ability to read it, and it's not in the ability for the words to be understood. It's completely just by the ontological fact that those words exist and they're now in my body is what matters to that person. So in that respect, you could say there's this special sort of object agency in the ink that's lent to it through the Quranic verse itself. So that would be a new animism or a new ontology method of thinking about that practice.
Oh man, I know that when you make, if this is like the way you approach things, when you make your voodoo video, it'll be way better than mine, and it'll be really cool.
Yeah.
All right, mythology guy wants to know, what about the apocalypse of Peter? I think this is like a follow-up when we were talking about the intended audiences of the books.
So there's a Gospel of Peter and there's an Apocalypse of Peter, and I think I'm sorry if I get this wrong. I do late anti-Christianity, not early Christianity. I think the Apocalypse of Peter is where Peter actually experiences like a trip through hell, and it's this heinous description of hell where people are. Oh man! So speaking of abortion, I think women that had an abortion are like being strung up in hell. And this is a 2nd century text. This is an ancient text. So talk about abortion debates in the 200s. It's kind of like Dante's Inferno in the 200s CE. Really wild text. I love it. So if the question is, what do I think of it? I think it's amazingly interesting. You should go read it. It's been a while since I read it, but the thing that sticks in my head is the journey through hell and the descriptions of the torture of, because it kind of lists, oh, these people were liars, these people were women that aborted babies, these people did this, and then they just have different punishments for each one. So
I also wrote a book about how I went to hell and all the people I didn't like were there.
Nice. Yeah, I'm gonna Google this real quick just to make sure I wasn't accidentally talking about the Gospel of Peter.
All right, while you're doing that, the next question's from me.
Yeah.
The alternate history thing's a separate channel, and it is not. It's just a stream I do once in a while that you can find if you go to the playlist tab. There's a playlist called Step Back Tonight, and one in every like 4 episodes is one of those.
Okay, I was right. Good. It's a discourse of the risen Christ, offering a vision first of heaven and then of hell granted to Peter. Okay, yeah, it's a great text. Everyone should read it.
Yeah. On the hell thing, there's like, what's interesting about the hell thing is like how hell has been getting worse like over time. Like there's like this whole study about how descriptions of hell get more and more violent and vivid the closer to the present we get. And that like there was this idea that like a long time ago, hell was just a place where like all of your sins would have been burned away before you could go off and do post-life stuff. But then it's turned into like the place of eternal torture and
it's, yeah, I mean, I'd be curious to see the study. I mean, at the very least, it gets worse and worse in the New Testament. It's not quite as bad in the Gospels. I mean, there's a little bit of fire, there's a lot of darkness and gnashing of teeth. But by the time you get to the book of Revelation, it's like a lake of fire. And by the time you get to the Apocalypse of Peter, it's like highly detailed torture scenes. I don't think there's any highly detailed torture scenes in the New Testament.
I think what's interesting though is that there's something interesting about the fact that like the Bible and like Christian descriptions of hell are very vivid and descriptions of heaven are very vague. And I think that that's interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah, maybe it's easier to think about what people don't want in terms of torture than what they want in heaven. That is interesting.
Yeah. All right. This comes from Golden Pelt, and the question is: the Book of Enoch was super influential in the Jewish religion around the time of Jesus. So why was it rejected from most Christian canons?
The thing is, I think it was rejected from Jewish canon too. It's not in the Septuagint. It's not in the Hebrew Bible. So I think it was already rejected by the time Jesus came around. So super influential, and influential enough to get this whole mythology around this character Enoch. I mean, he's just a throwaway character in the Hebrew Bible. He just appears very briefly in the book of Genesis. Then suddenly he's, becoming the archangel Metatron and helping.
Which, by the way, an amazing name for a transformer. If everyone wants to make one,
I know it's a great name.
Alan Rickman was my favorite.
The answer would be the short answer would be like it was already rejected, so that's why it didn't make it in. Like the Septuagint Bible, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, is kind of the foundation of the Christian Bible, and anything that's not in the Septuagint, doesn't really make it into Christianity.
Mm-hmm. Seriously, Metatron, that's a great name.
It's such a great name.
I always think of Alan Rickman when he played the Metatron in the movie Dogma. If there's not a movie about it, you haven't heard of it. I
mean, there needs to be a movie about Enoch. I don't know why there hasn't been one.
He's like, oh, the last plague. Oh, Charlton Heston makes a movie about it, and you're a theology scholar. If you ever feel like watching a funny movie that kind of talk about Dogma, it's like 20 years old now, but it's my favorite. What's it called? My favorite Kevin Smith movie.
Nice.
Because basically it kind of pokes fun at like the human institutions of religion and how the absolutes are what kill them. So the plot of it basically is that because the Catholics have the whole diocese and like the rules and everything's very solid.
Yeah.
That like they start a new church in New Jersey because every movie by Kevin Smith takes place in New Jersey. And what they did was, in order to get people back into Catholicism, they're starting this new PR campaign called the Catholicism Wow campaign, in which they replace the crucifix, they rebrand the crucifix, but also anybody who walks through the gates of the church would be forgiven for all of their sins. But then there's two angels that God cast out of heaven that are like living on earth. And if they go through it, it would prove God wrong and basically unright existence, who are played by Matt Damon and what's his name? Not Brad Pitt. Matt Damon and what's Matt Damon's best friend? What's his name? Batman.
Oh yeah. Ben Affleck.
Ben Affleck. And the two of them are the two angels. It's fun.
How have I not watched this? This is great.
Because it came out in 1997. And
yeah.
I'm like the only person who's seen it.
But speaking of movies, like I've always lamented the fact that Emperor Constantine does not show up in any movie. Like think of how many movies and TV shows are about Julius Caesar, Augustus, that Roman period. But Constantine and everything after him is so Game of Thrones crazy that it needs to have its own HBO series. And there's like nothing Constantinian era in modern media. It's just a complete and utter travesty.
I think I have seen it. I believe it had Tilda Swinton playing Satan or playing Angel Gabriel. And it had, what's his name?
It had Constantine?
I'm making another really dumb joke.
Okay, I'm missing something.
I'm referring to the mid 2000s film Constantine, which starred Keanu Reeves as John Constantine, the Hellblazer character, and Tilda Swinton plays an angel.
Yeah, your pop culture references are going over my head.
Sorry. I have pop culture references, and like the whole thing is that like the audience here are so much younger than me that like the pop culture references only make sense to people born between like 1988 and like 1985 and like 1990. And I don't know. Actually, I don't even know how old you are. You could be the same age as me, probably.
29.
Okay, yeah, you're a year younger than me.
Okay.
All right, Wolframium, what do you think about Luba Victor's Jews? Isn't it hypocritical to recognize there as rabbi as the Moshiach and reject Jesus with the same evidence? I am so lost.
I'm kind of lost too. Yeah, Moshiach is the Hebrew for Messiah, but I'm lost, unfortunately. Sorry.
All right. Only Bro 555. Who/where was the first atheist? Are there any good are there any good Roman spell books that can easily be found?
Yes, my copy is downstairs. So Roman spell book first. It's called the Greek Magical Papyri. It's edited by the scholar named Hans Betz, Betz. And it's just this huge compendium of Greco-Egyptian spells from the Egyptian province the Roman province of Egypt. So all date to the 400s, 300s, 400s. Amazing texts. Everyone should buy this book and read them. First question was, who was the first atheist? Is that what it was?
Yeah.
Oh man. It was probably some Homo sapien from 250,000 BC who's like, no, that doesn't exist. What are you talking about? Like,
I will point out there is actually, I got to get their name because I reference them quite a bit. There's a ethnic group that lives in West Africa that have for a very long time, they have a sort of cultural, I almost want to say it's spiritual, but a spiritual belief in like extreme, like not epistemology, like they believe very directly that the only things that can be true are things that they have directly experienced and watched.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that would be epistemology. Yeah,
and but like I think like the idea that like it's not there. Like there's like a term for like when you empiricist. That's
extreme empiricism. Yeah,
and they believe that like they are extreme, like they can only believe in things that they have directly witnessed, and
wow.
That means that they are effectively atheists.
Yeah. I will say, so one of my favorite books is Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. And Marcus Aurelius has a whole passage on, if the gods don't exist, then who cares? So like even back then in the 200s, you had Romans theorizing that the gods don't really exist. So, atheism is not a new concept. Even the Greeks and the Romans were theorizing about it.
Yeah, there's also a Greek philosopher who I think originated the concept of the atom, who is also pretty notably an atheist.
Yeah, the one I'm thinking about is Lucretius, who's a Roman philosopher who writes atom, but the atom.
All right, let's find out. I'm sure somebody's Democritus.
Democritus,
yeah,
okay.
Is the philosopher who was basically an atheist, or he did this like kind of very Greek thought where it's like, oh, if the gods are infinitely good, but infinitely and infinitely powerful, then like where are they coming and helping us? And so therefore, God either doesn't exist or God is powerful but doesn't care about us, and therefore,
yeah. I mean, it's pretty hubristic for us to think that these really smart Greeks and other philosophers from around the world did not already think about this. They definitely already considered that these supernatural beings did not exist.
Mm-hmm. Do you think Christianity and Islam would stop growing in the global South if the poverty levels there were drastically reduced?
Oh, wow. That's a really good question.
Because it's not even like that. Like one of the things I think is really interesting is how in Brazil, there's like another wave of religious colonization where Protestant movements are edging out the Catholics. And
The Economist just published an article on this, that the global South is now sending out like tens of thousands of Christian missionaries to the global North, to places like Western Europe and the United States, which are now considered to be godless. My hunch is, I think as poverty levels go down, birth rates go down, religions grow primarily through birth rates. Adult conversion is actually pretty rare when you look at the data. And countries that are growing the fastest are growing fast because of birth rates, usually, obviously. And these also happen to be Islamic or sometimes Christian nations. I'm thinking about Nigeria in particular. So my hunch is, that the growth will slow if global poverty rates decline.
On that note, I read this thing, and I want to get a follow-up because I think it would make super cool to if it is actually true, which is that based on, because there's this whole thought that like, oh, there's like this population bomb that's going to go off in West Africa over the next few decades, and that because like already the other places that we thought were going to be like the really populated places are starting to slow down, but West Africa's not, because they they're just getting out of all sorts of nasty stuff in their history. But that if this bomb goes off the way, like if this population explosion goes off the way that they think, that by the end of the 21st century, one of the most spoken language on earth will be French. And I'm just like, awesome. Good thing.
Yeah.
C'est bon, sir. C'est bon.
Lingua franca becomes literal.
Yeah.
Huh.
All right. some random geek, me personal, I think imperialism had an effect on the spread of Christianity. Would Andrew and Step Back History agree? I mean,
we did mention this early on in the stream. I think so. Yeah, I mean, like the fact that Europe was primarily Christian and that Europe literally, conquered the world in some respects. Yeah, I think there's a reason why the Aztec and Mayan religions kind of disappeared, and now Roman Catholicism is so popular in Mexico and South America, and that's a direct result from imperialism.
Mm-hmm. All right. What was religion like in America before the American Revolution? The United States was supposedly built on Christian values. What about British North America? Wasn't it even more religious? I mean, I can speak to this a little bit because actually you spent a lot of time in Boston, but like America was, a lot of the people who went to the American colonies at first were sort of the religious outcasts of England and the English world. And so they kind of had all of these small movements that were kind of marginal in England become mainstream in America. And that's why like America has like a particularly hardcore religious tradition.
Yeah, you probably know more about this as the American Studies guy. From my understanding, yeah, they were a lot of outcasts trying to find, the new land to be free from England's, state religion. Essentially, all the European countries had state religions. It was a hodgepodge of Protestants and Catholics. And they didn't all agree with each other. The Pennsylvania was Quaker and had more open rules than Massachusetts. Massachusetts was Puritan and kind of kicked out guys like Roger Williams, who had to set up shop in Rhode Island. So this whole idea of like religious freedom being the bedrock of the American colonies, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was not friendly toward Christians that were not of their stripe. It was not a religiously free colony.
Mm-hmm. I will say, like, after the United States was founded, there were like great awakenings and all sorts of stuff like that too that kind of contribute to it. But yeah, a lot of like the English, like the way, like one of the things that happened after the British lost the American colonies is like, oh, where are we going to stick all of our rejects? And then they were like, then Captain Cook was like, all right, guys, I've got this amazing place I found, and
yeah,
Australia.
Though I do want everyone in the stream to go look up Roger Williams. Like the whole history of Rhode Island is interesting and like kind of the bedrock of religious freedom. So it's in the U.S. Constitution, First Amendment, and a lot of that comes from Roger Williams, and he was kind of a forward thinker, more so than other American colony founders. I think he was really ahead of his time.
You'd be really surprised in the American Constitution how many things that we think of as like bedrock, unchangeable, like canon of America were things that were really up for debate. Like they were only a few votes away from going from King George III to King George I.
Yeah.
Yeah,
agreed. And like a few votes away from like state religion, and now we have this kind of religious freedom in the DNA of the U.S.
Mm-hmm. All right. What type of Hellenistic government are we talking about? I think they're talking about like the Hellenistic influence on biblical era. But we only have like about 13 minutes left, so we'll just move ahead and get into.
Okay.
Is there any evidence for the historicity of Bodhidharma?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm completely unversed in Eastern religions. I'm assuming we're referencing something from Buddhism. This is a criticism I get a lot from my audience is like, why don't you cover more Buddhism and Hinduism? And it's like, I just don't know enough. I'm a scholar, I'm an educator, and I'm afraid to disseminate bad information. So more videos will come when I can find the right collaborators.
There's another one in all caps. Would Jesus be considered a hippie by today's standards?
Yes. Well, maybe he would be considered an outcast too. Yeah.
He'd be considered a vagrant by today's standards.
Yeah, a vagrant of some sort.
Do you follow the Noahide laws?
I don't know. A few people have mentioned this, and every time I Google it, and every time I forget what they are.
All right. All right. In your opinion, this is 255 AD. In your opinion, in your Emperor Decius video, you
Mhm.
talked exclusively about Christians. Were there any/many Jewish or Zoroastrian monotheists who faced persecution for refusing to sacrifice to the Roman gods?
Okay, I'm stretching deep into my memory banks here. I'm not sure about the Decian persecution, but yes, in the Diocletian persecution. So the Decian persecution happened in the 250s, and most of what we know about that was aimed against Christians. In the late 200s, early 300s with Diocletian, we have an actual edict written by Diocletian that says we need to persecute the Manichees. So Manichaeism was a similar dualistic religion, heavily influenced by Zoroastrianism, and Diocletian hated them just as much as he hated the Christians. And that's interesting. We have an actual document that's just an edict against the Manichees, and he calls it like a virulent superstition, like same sort of language that he used against Christians. So whether they were swept up in the Decian persecution 60 years before, I'm not sure. We don't have the data, but go Google the Diocletian edict against the Manichees and have your mind blown. It's one of the coolest historical documents out there.
Yeah, that's another one of my like top requested religion videos is the Manichaeanism, and there's still a couple of them kicking around.
Yeah, the Mandeans as well. One of those declining religions that we forget about is still around.
What do you think of the Baha'i?
They're cool. I went to a Baha'i meeting just a few weeks ago. Just sat down at the Baha'i table and we chatted about life, the universe, and everything. I visited Haifa and Akko, so I saw the Baha'i gardens and made a whole video about it. Yeah, I think it's a very interesting religion. It's very pan-religion. It's kind of a progressive idea of all religions have a grain of truth. Each religious founder is a messenger of God. I think it's interesting to have a religion that's so committed to the pan-religion ideal.
All right, I'm not going to be taking any more questions, and we're just going to finish off the list and then move on because there's a handful, and we'll just finish those, and then I will let you go and be free.
Great.
All right. There's another kind of opinion on this is from Danman 1950. Opinions on Pastafarianism.
Pastafarianism is like the joke religion. That's kind of like
making fun of the logical fallacies in Christianity. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm all about trolls if it's done well. Like I like the Satanic Temple and how they troll, setting up statues of Baphomet in state courthouses. So like if the trolling is done smart to make up specific political point, that's great. I don't know enough about the Pastafarians trolling to know if they're like actually making good points though. Like
most of the time, all the tenets of their faith are sort of like based on taking kind of ridiculous things and using the same logic for something silly. Like they claim that the rise in global temperatures is tied to the decline in pirates. And so therefore they think people should dress like pirates in order to stop global warming because it's like making fun of the correlation causation thing.
Yeah. Well, this is why the Supreme Court has this whole clause of sincerely held faith. In all the religious freedom court cases, they always use the term sincerely held faith. And I think they would try to use that against the Pastafarians. And I'd be curious to see if that's ever made it to a Supreme Court.
Yeah, I think the other thing they have is they believe very much in something called intelligent falling, which is that they don't believe in the theory of gravity. They believe in the whole that they're just being held down. Funny story about that. I went to a pizza place with a friend of my wife's who's very, very, very religious, and she doesn't know about the Pastafarian stuff, but the restaurant has a Pastafarian like theme to it, and I'm always just like,
That's pretty funny.
Yeah. All right, mythology guy. Didn't Jews have a form of hell that wasn't fire, but more of a cold nothingness?
I wouldn't call it hell though. It's called Sheol, and I think everybody goes to Sheol. So if you read the Hebrew Bible, even the good guys end up in Sheol. It's just it's nothingness, like you said. It's shadowy nothingness, but everybody goes there. So it's an undifferentiated afterlife. But by the time of Jesus' time, it's differentiated between good and bad. So this is where I think the Hellenistic influence came in, because you have Sheol, but now it's like bad, burning, gnashing teeth Sheol. I would much rather
do like Hades and the underworld and what's it called? Elysium. Yeah.
I would rather be in Sheol than hell. Let's say that.
I think the like Norse had that too with like with Valhalla and stuff. So maybe it's like a European thing. All right, 255 AD, another question. Suppose I'm an aristocratic Roman pagan living 1700 years ago. To what extent will this prevent me from being able to gain political power in Constantine's empire?
To what extent? Sorry, you cut out for a bit.
All right, suppose I'm an aristocratic Roman pagan living in the 2nd century or the 4th century.
4th century. Yeah.
To what extent will this prevent me from being able to gain political power in Constantine's empire?
I think your cards are increasingly stacked against you, because Christian bishops become the guys you need to deal with. You have these, a Christian bishop in Rome or Ephesus in the 300s is a politician in some respects, who has the ear of the emperor or the governor. So it's not impossible. You have a Julian that comes along and he tries to revive, the pagan spirit among the emperors, but he was the last pagan emperor. The rest are Christians. So you can still have power. The Greek philosophy schools were not closed down until Justinian in the 500s. So it's not like you can't have power, but you're on the downswing.
Mm-hmm. All right. Cooper wants to know if we can answer this question. I think we can. Ferdinand, opinion. Oh, the Baha'i faith question again. What do you and Andrew know about the Apocalypse of Peter? Okay, we did that. Gad Yariv, who is from Israel, who's a regular on the channel. Would equating between religion and partisan politics be legitimate as a way it can provide a social communal frame for people to organize themselves by or to define themselves by?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, we have this whole term civic religion or civil religion. Robert Bella is the scholar that's usually pointed to talk about civic religion. And his whole argument is that like the patriotic partisanship that you see in American politics is parallel to religion. We have a sacred song. It's called the national anthem. We have a sacred ritual, which is like putting your hand over your heart or taking your hat off. We have mythological founders, that are real, like George Washington, but we mythologize them and we say, oh, well, the founding fathers did this and this. And like, well, you're putting words in the mouth of these guys. Maybe they didn't say that. Mm-hmm. So there are definite religious-y impetuses in politics that are not supernatural, but religion adjacent. For sure.
Yeah. I think if you haven't seen it, anybody who's here should see a painting called "The Apotheosis of Washington." It's in Congress, and if you don't believe in civic religion, just look at that painting.
Well, there's that other famous statue of him where he's like this bare-chested Zeus with his hand up like this. He looks like Zeus, and it's Washington. He was like this Englishman that probably did not have a single muscle to his abs. He didn't have six-pack abs, but this statue he does.
Yeah, and also I think there's actually like a direct reference to the Lincoln Memorial being a temple.
Oh yeah, it's called a temple. It's like it's inscribed in there.
Yeah. All right, Night Watcher's Pet, our chat moderator. Thank you so much for taking care, wrangling up people in there. Question. Did the experience of watching the goat die make you think you should become a vegetarian or a vegan?
No, that's kind of hypocritical of me, isn't it? No, I still eat goat, but I saw its little body twitching after its head was chopped off, and it disgusted me.
Gad Yariv has another question. This is the same Israeli guy, so this has more poignancy. Why was Aryanism so popular amongst the Germans?
I don't know why, but in terms of religious studies, the very interesting thing that happened in Nazi Germany was Christian theologians trying to de-Judaize Jesus, where they're like, oh, he's not a Jew. He was actually a Greek philosopher. And so you had this whole movement to Aryanize Jesus. And in fact, I think one of the books I read for my dissertation, my qualifying exams, was called The Aryan Jesus. I forget who writes it though, but that's a good book if you want to see like a 20th century historiography of Nazi German Christian theologians.
Mm-hmm. All right, Emperor Alexander, thoughts on Hinduism and how it's considered one of the most peaceful, kind-hearted religions of the world, a lot like Sikhism in many ways. I think we could talk like that's a little bit about like how white Buddhism is like a thing.
Yeah.
Like how Buddhism is treated like it's like this pacifist, peaceful religion, but like they're committing a genocide against Muslims and in Myanmar, and like
Yeah. I mean, this goes back to people. Um, I just made a video on this, the no true Scotsman fallacy, where it's like, oh, Buddhism is a peaceful religion. We're like, well, what about Ashin Warathu, who's like literally killing Muslims in Myanmar? Like, oh, well, he's not a true Buddhist. So they no true Scotsman fallacy, the thing. So when you say, oh, Hinduism is one of the most peaceful religions, I'm like, well, there's also massive riots and massacres between the Muslim and Hindu populations in India. It's like, and that's not to say Hinduism is a violent religion. It's just saying that like Hinduism is embedded in a culture that has these fault lines between different communities that are centuries old. So it's hard to it's a fallacy to say one religion is peaceful or violent. You say there are violent communities that use these religions to legitimate their violence, or that it's somehow an operative factor in their violence. So I guess I would push back against the question's premise.
can we like just take that quote and use it over and over again by all of the Islamophobic people out there?
Yeah, we should. I mean, it's the same with Islam, where it's like no true Scotsman fallacy left and right talking about Islam. You have violence and you have peace, but none of them are intrinsic to the religion. The religion is embedded in cultures, and those cultures do what cultures do, which is fight and sometimes not fight. And yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What's your cat's name? My cat's name. This cat is Phoebe. I have another one named Romeo. That's not here. I don't know where he is. He's somewhere. But that's Phoebe, and she's the one who's most likely in the stream. You have any pets?
Do I have any pets? No. Petless.
Okay. 25580 question. I read a historical novel that had a character who's a Roman Christian who's afraid of being arrested and tortured. Is that an anachronism in AD 235?
No, it's not an anachronism. I do think that, I mean, the persecution of Christians was very local. You know, it was happening in some towns and some cities, but not others. So if he was living in North Africa in the 230s, yeah, there's a pretty good chance, because we know there was a huge persecution of Christians in the 250s in North Africa. You know, maybe not so much in parts of Asia Minor, or so it depends on where he is. It's not accurate to think of it as like the 20th century Nazi Holocaust of the Jews. Like there's just not a systematic hunting up down of Christians, except under Diocletian. It was more systematic there. Persecution otherwise was local, depending on certain Roman governors who saw them as politically subversive. Because the Romans had this very strict idea of like, if your religion is from the East, if your religion is being done in houses away from the public eye, you must be plotting against the empire, and therefore we must persecute you. It's the whole concept of superstition that the Romans kind of built up. So yeah, not anachronistic if it's in North Africa.
All right. Is there a consensus about why Christianity was so successful at spreading so fast, or?
There's not a consensus. There's a theory, you know, the guy Rodney Stark, who's a sociologist, wrote a whole book about it, and he argued for like, you know, better birth rates and more cohesive communities that helped each other more. So no, I would love to see like I think once they get the reins of power, it was a done deal. So even when Constantine kind of legalized Christianity, it was a minority. I would say like 10% of the population probably. But once it becomes the favored minority, it really took off. So I don't know if it was guaranteed success until that. So the real question would be, why was it so popular in those first 3 centuries before Constantine?
Yeah. All right, another 255 AD question. Suppose you raised a bunch of babies to be hunter-gatherers and then dumped them on another very Earth-like planet. Do you think that they or their descendants would eventually recreate religion?
Yes. I've thought about this. I've thought about this exact same thought experiment, and I think they would, because I think the impulse for religion is hardwired biologically, because humans are hardwired to look for agency in non-agental things. Like when you're there's wind going through the tree branches, and you think, oh man, there must be someone around. You can think about like a human in 250,000 BC seeing wind or water and thinking this has agency somehow, or seeing an animal. We do this all the time. Your cat in the back probably is on. So by the same token, I think if you dumped a bunch of babies, hunter-gatherer babies, onto an island, their innate ability and tendency to ascribe agency to animals and objects would eventually create what we have as religion.
Yeah, I would also think that there's something about on top of like the seeing agency thing. I think that there's something very hardwired into the way our memory functions, where narrative is extremely important. And so being able to explain why things are the way they are with a story lends itself to religion, religious, like mythological thinking and things like that. So
no, I don't think they would necessarily, this group of, test babies wouldn't necessarily invent Christianity or Hinduism or Buddhism, but they would invent something, whatever it would be.
All right. What's your thought on any of Reza Aslan's work? I don't know who that is.
Oh, really? He's kind of popular. Reza Aslan, he's a scholar. He's a sociologist who's also kind of a scholar of religion. He's fine. He's just kind of, he has this idea of religion as like, all religion is like somehow related. So it's kind of a Joseph Campbell way to think about religion. So I disagree with him on that premise. His TV show on CNN was okay, but parts of it were just highly sensationalized. I like the interviews on his TV show. He interviewed like evangelicals or ex-Scientologists. So it was very interesting ethnographic research. His book, Zealot, is just outdated. So he's fine. People hate him. A lot of people like to hate on Reza Aslan. I think he's okay. I think I'm doing a better job. So
I'm thinking like, man, like there's another documentary that I just like, they play every Christmas on the History Channel, and it's this multi-part series that has like Morgan Freeman, and I just it's so like they have to go so far to be able to be like, okay, Christians, like you're like, to not illegitimize anything that any Christian, like they're trying to be very safe, and in doing so they really can't
say anything.
Yeah.
So I mean, Reza Aslan, I will say, doesn't deserve the amount of hate that he gets. I mean, some people a lot of like the Sam Harris crew will just pile on the guy. He is a scholar of religion. His dissertation was on religion, like jihad in the early 20th century. His book on Islam, No God But God, is decent. My problems with him are kind of his branding. Like he's just more of like an angry political commentator at this point. If you go to his Twitter feed, he's just constantly just complaining about politics. He's not really a religious studies educator anymore. So my problems with him are more about how he comports himself, not so much about his work.
Alrighty. And we've got two more questions. What do you think about cargo cults?
I don't know enough about them. I just know the word. I'm sorry.
Oh, you'll find this pretty fascinating, especially with our discussion about the ontology stuff. So what happened is that during World War II, the United States had to basically go to these random, because it was all about an island hop across the Pacific Ocean, and they ended up stopping in a bunch of places that were very sparsely inhabited, or places that did not have very many, not much outside contact. A lot of Polynesian groups that have had very sparse contact with the outside. And they would do stuff like set up military bases or set up forward command posts and things like that. But then they would sometimes, give things to the local inhabitants. And what they found is that on some of these islands, years later, there are people who worship, they built these effigies of airplanes, and because they were seeing airplanes in the sky, and then all of a sudden these modern day convenient things come, and so they were trying to make the airplane so they could have more common. These are called cargo cults. And
that's so interesting.
Yeah. It's pretty cool stuff. I think that in some ways it's been a bit romanticized. I think that people have made it up to be more than it is.
Yeah.
But it is still an interesting thing that has happened.
Yeah.
All right. The last question goes to Gad Yariv. And It is, what is the source of Judaism's and Islam's anti-art attitudes, and when did that actually start?
Yeah, the technical term is aniconism. Anti-icons, aniconism. When did it start? I think it's hard to argue that it's hard to argue against that it's somehow tied to the concept of God. Both Judaism and Islam have this highly, very monotheistic theology. Christianity bifurcates God into three. God the Son, God the Father, God the Holy Spirit. But to Jews and Muslims, that's crazy. No, God is one. And part of that is you can't depict him. Like you shouldn't depict him. So where it came from exactly, I mean, at least in the very ancient Israelites, there's some evidence that they depicted Yahweh as a bull, similar how Baal, the Canaanite god, was depicted with a bull. So sometime in the early Iron Age, they moved away from depicting Yahweh as a bull and depicting him as nothing, this undepictable being. So I think it's so deeply ingrained in that theology that it spills into art, where you can't depict humans. At least in Islamic art, you don't depict Muhammad. And if you go inside the Dome of the Rock, it's all aniconic art. It's flowers and vines and geometric shapes, but no humans or animals. So I don't know exactly where it comes from, but I would say it's theologically inspired.
All right. And is this similar or not similar to like the iconoclastic type movements?
Yeah, I would say it's similar, where the Christian iconoclasts can't depict. Once you depict it, you're making an idol. You're making a graven image. So similar impulse, but the iconoclast lost. There's now icons everywhere in Christianity. So similar impulse for sure.
All right. Well, that is all. That is we're past the time allotted, but I want to, before you go, make sure that everybody knows where to go find more of your amazing expertise in the videos you're putting out.
Yeah, no, great. It was great to have me. Nice chat.
So where should they go?
Oh, they should go to Religion for Breakfast, youtube.com/Religion for Breakfast.
And you've been writing articles or something, haven't you?
Yeah, so I work for The Atlantic in Washington, D.C., so I'm kind of working on their religion coverage team. So yeah, look for my articles coming out of The Atlantic.
Alrighty. Well, that's been awesome. Given how many questions we got, we should definitely get you back sometime. So
yeah, for sure. Be down for it.
Take care.
Yeah, see ya.
I think that the way that this whole thing works is that I can't just push the end thing button, so I'm gonna have to hang up the call. So anyways, thank you so much, Andrew, and I will see all of you guys on the internet. No Step Back Tonight next week or the week after. Next week I have a thing. I might not have a thing. Oh wait, next we'll figure it out. The weekend after I'm going to Come From Away, the Broadway musical. So I'll see y'all later.